Let's just start with kind of an icebreaker question, which is, how has the work environment changed in your business and over your career? And do you have any examples of utilizing network leadership to drive performance, and to what effect, good or bad? So I'm going to start with that question. And Beth, I will start with you to the right.
Well, first of all, good morning and welcome to a great morning. Really appreciated the comments from our speakers this morning. Thank you to Jody and to Phyllis, and as well as to Kate for putting on today. So really appreciate the opportunity to be here today. You know, some of you may think of Nicor Gas on those very cold days when you wake up and your house is still warm and you're able to take a hot shower. But a lot of you probably don't know that 3 years ago, Nicor Inc., the parent company of Nicor Gas, and AGL Resources, a company based in Atlanta, Georgia, merged, and to create one of the largest natural gas-only distribution companies in the United States. And as a result of that merger, I got the opportunity to come up here and lead Nicor Gas. And I was one of 2 people to actually physically move from Atlanta to Illinois. And the question I always get is, did you like the weather? And my response has to be, if you run the gas company, you love the weather. You know. So I moved up, and you know, we had the opportunity. We'd done integration planning for about a year prior to the merger, and that involved 70 to about 150 people across the enterprise, and I had the opportunity to lead that. So I had started to build my relationships. But I got to come up here, and I was responsible for 2,000 people who had no idea really where Atlanta was, and how do we start to bring these businesses together? And any of you who've worked on mergers and acquisitions know that it's a long process, that it is not a, congratulations, today we're closed, and tomorrow we're a new company. But it goes back to networked leadership. And the way I think about it, and I thought Julie did a fabulous job of putting a definition out there for us, but it's all about relationships. And the further up in the organization you go, and some of you are probably having some of these revelations, is it really is, how do you leverage those relationships so that you can know what's going on? And you can help people to move through and make decisions. So when I got up here, and somebody this morning made this comment, I think Patty did in her comments, of when she was accepted the role of one of the only women at Fortune, she had people look at her and say, well, I've got to be the first woman president of a utility company, gas only. And I had a lot of people look at me and say, really? You know, they never said it, obviously. But what did I do? So I went out and just spent time in the field. I went out and shook people's hands so they could get to know me. And based on that, I could start building the network of who are the people who are the influencers out there, who could really help me understand what was going on. I had lunch with every one of the directors, and believe me, they were panicked that they were having to sit down with the president of Nicor Gas with no agenda. And it was really just so that I could get to know who they were and where they were coming from, because I knew I was going to have to draw on them in the future. So it's building a foundation of relationships. It's keeping those relationships up. So my experience in transitioning through this change has really enabled me over, if I look at the last 3 years, I really have a deep bench of network from frontline guys all the way through to the leadership to tell me what's going on. What do I know? People don't just walk into the president's office and say, you know, you need to know X, Y, Z. You have people out there who are networking back in. And being one of 2 people who moved up here from Atlanta, I really had to help my team know who they needed to know in Atlanta, because not all 2,000 of them get to go to Atlanta. So who do they need to know? And when somebody comes up, how do they network with them? So my biggest message to everyone is build your network, and that starts with developing relationships. And everybody likes to eat lunch. And very few people will say no when you say, would you mind eating lunch with me?
Thank you. Tonise, do you want to give us your insights on that question?
Sure. Looking back, you asked about looking back on one's career, and we realized that I do have the long view on this, and more has changed than my bad silk tie and 1985 Mark Shale suit.
So there are others on this stage who remember that outfit, the little bow tie.
We all had that outfit.
And the starched white shirts.
But what's interesting in looking that far back, I would honestly say that what we've seen by way of change in our industry in the past 5 years is as much as we saw in the 20 before that. The changes in technology have given us different tools to engage consumers with our brands, and it's changed consumers' expectations of how we're going to engage with them. So everything's different in the last 5 years. I came across a quote, or actually a data point from a study that was conducted by a firm called CEB, and it was a global study, 23,000 leaders and managers, and they asked about the rate of change in their organizations in the past year. And more than 50% of them said that it had been significant change that in their organization and down to their personal level. And I have to say, I would have been one of those people that said extreme change in the past 12 months in my organization. I bet we'd meet or exceed the 1 out of 2 people here for that. So change has just been tremendous and dramatic. So I was thinking about pointing out the most profound change for us. And it's really, Mary talked, hello Mary, I didn't get a chance to say hi. But Mary talked about collaboration. And the shift that we're seeing is from what I call simple collaboration to complex co-creation. So the need to be collaborative, I think we may have a competitive advantage in our business, because in a creative business, you know, that's how you make sparks fly, you collaborate. But what we were doing historically is bringing disciplines together. Now, what I say complex co-creation, we're doing the work together, we're conceiving ideas together, implementing it together, but the complexity comes from, it's not just different disciplines within your organization, it's often different companies, it's media platforms like Google and Facebook and Pinterest, which are a part of our day-to-day life, fortunately, it makes things very exciting, and we're doing all that globally. So the level of complexity has been great, and it has really created a need for the network leader. So as I was thinking about this, I was saying that is the leader, team leader from even 6 years ago to the team leader today is different. And one of the parts of your question was, how have you been successful with this? And we have been able to expand our relationships with existing clients, and as well as win some new big global clients through the strength of this network leadership. And there's been 3 things really that have helped a lot. One is those leaders themselves, having people in our organization who are really adept at network leadership. And those are people who know that it's not about position anymore. It really is about influence. It's about fanning the flames of creativity. It's about creating a sense of trust among the team, which is very difficult to do when you have people who don't work in your company and people when you're working in multi-local situations. So you have to have people who are trusted because they are trustworthy. But those people also need some support systems, I've found. The piece that they need is they need a network leadership structure. So if you take that network leader, and that person is surrounded by representatives from the various constituents, what happens is you're able to tap each of those networks, right? So the disciplines, the alternative companies that are part of it. And the third thing that we've found really has helped our success has been having some operating principles for network leadership. It isn't a no-brainer. So a network leader who brings people together and says, look, for us to be our powerful best selves, we need to align on a set of operating principles, and gets everybody on that same page. And then not only is everyone aligned, but they can hold each other accountable. And an example of what one of those principles are for us is the client's best interest comes first. Because when you have a multifaceted team like that, if you have one group that it's about them, it throws the dynamic out of whack. So if everybody's aligned on this isn't about us, but what the work we're doing, it can be very powerful.
One of the things you mentioned is it's not about the power of the position, which I think is so true, that people who are really effective at network leadership understand that It's not about their title. It's not about where they sit in the organization or who reports to them. But it's really about finding those people who are the influencers and connectors to help you create that network to, focus on an outcome. So I want to kind of move into that because I think it really depends on the people that are within. So how do you go about identifying connectors and influencers within your organization, particularly when we think about the diversity of any network? There might be diversity of opinions, education, background, personalities, leadership styles, et cetera, et cetera. So, Vicki, you want to take a stab at that? How do you go about identifying those networkers, those influencers and connectors?
Sure. So I'm sure that when some of you looked at my profile, you thought, here's an airline person with a lot of experience in running global operations, marketing with Delta Airlines, and now 2 fairly significant nonprofits. So what did you know about running a nonprofit? And I kiddingly always say, if you look at the profitability of airlines since Kitty Hawk, I actually went right into the job knowing a fair amount about running nonprofits. But to answer your question, it's interesting when you look at this idea of network leadership, and is it different in the for-profit space versus the nonprofit space? And I actually think they're very similar. And I look for 4 things. The first is throughout the organization, and Opportunity International is global. We're in 22 countries. So I'm looking at where is the knowledge? Where are the knowledge learners across the organization? So you've got to have those technical people to really help you with your network. Then I look at where are the influencers? And clearly they're all over the place. They can be frontline employees. They can be very senior people. This notion always comes to me that one of my favorite CEOs, Leo Mullen, who's from Chicago, used to say, would people follow you even if you didn't have your title? And I think it's a good thing for us all to remember. So who are the influencers that we know and can help us get our work done? The third group of people that I look for are who are the communications people? Who are the people that are going to get the word out around the work that we're doing and really get our voice into our work? And then the last but not least, certainly very important group of people that I look to for support around this idea of network leadership are the support people. So we all know our assistants and the assistants across the globe that are leading the organization, helping support various leaders are really important around setting up a group of individuals that can use your influence to really get the job done around network leadership.
One of the things we talk about in network leadership is it's about access.
Yeah.
And many people in this room in a very senior leadership position, you said it. As president, I went around and set up all these lunches and visited. But not everybody is in that role where you're immediately granted access. So there are any types of tips that you would suggest in how do you gain access to those people who might be the technical knowledge, who might be that you can understand as the communicator?
Yeah.
I think that's the biggest issue for everybody is how do you know? And I can just throw out a couple examples for me is first of all, power of observation. I'm one of those people that sits in meetings, and when I do go around the company, notwithstanding my position, of really sitting back and observing the people in the room to try to figure out what role they play and how they might be effective to whatever strategic initiative I have underway. So it's part of it's power of observation, and the other is listening posts, which I think is something you have to develop over time and something you need to develop when you are continuing to build your career, not when you've gotten to a point where where you need to. So for me, within Navigant, I have a lot of what I call listening posts in the organization that are people who were there when I was 20 years ago as a young professional, or who I've done small projects with, and you realize that they're tapped into a network that you want to hear from. And so you want to maintain that relationship. Is there anything else that
So
you want to
maybe
add?
one comment, and I certainly don't want to do all the talking because I want to hear from you.
Yep.
But I think being accessible and making sure that as you plan your year and how you're going to work, to at least plan, for me, 30 to 40% of being, nobody really is learning that much behind the office, no leader is, and being out with clients and customers. and learning those 4 groups of people that I talked about, I think is so critically important. Mary said it today. If you really want to be a client or customer-focused organization, you've got to be out with the people. And that's where you really learn how to influence the organization, in my opinion.
Great, thank you. I want to just pause for a second, look out at the audience. Do we have a question in the back? If you want to just stand over at the microphone, thank you.
Good morning. My name is Z. Scott. I'm a partner in a law firm here in Chicago, where my job is to help companies with regulatory issues. The question you're talking sort of generally and across industries about networked leadership. So I'm trying to understand, when you're in the networks or you're developing the networks or you're trying to tease out where the networks, where you want to be, what kind of information are you looking for that's going to be helpful to you as a leader? I mean, maybe that's something that's it's unique to your organization, but are there sort of broad data points that you are looking for, looking to learn from people that will be helpful to you as a leader?
It's interesting for me. I have the problem first before I determine who to seek out. So it's not a general desire to have a certain kind of information. It's when I have a challenge and I realize that I need a little help with it, I then think who's best able to help me? Who do I already know? And then who might they know? So whether it's you're looking for a different kind of a connection in order to accomplish something new for the business, it's a starting point, which is, what is that challenge that I have that I really need to reach out beyond my current network and make a connection with some people who just might be able to answer that particular question for me.
I would add something to that. I think that for leaders, you can sometimes get in a situation where you're somewhat isolated, right? You're hearing from your direct reports, you're in scheduled meetings, and people who have access to you and whom you have access to are pretty much scripted. And so I think sometimes leaders are looking for other voices to help get a better sense of what's happening in an organization as they're thinking about whether it's a challenge or a new strategic direction that they're contemplating, understanding better the culture, the climate, what are people really talking about in the organization. So sometimes it's reaching out purely for getting a different voice in your ear if you're somewhat removed because of position.
I also think that we talked about decisions aren't made on the linear organizational chart. I do think, I totally agree with you, it's really isolating. The higher up you go in an organization, I've told people that the biggest surprise, I had my board say, what's the biggest surprise after you became CEO? And I said, I'm so isolated. I don't have the same communication flows. But I look at it as the operational stuff seems to get done on the organizational chart. What do you have to do? Who's got the role? Who's got the responsibility for it? You need network leadership to get the strategic stuff done, because you need to understand where that information is going to come from. Oftentimes it's not within your standard ranks of reporting lines. And I think to think about the future and to think about strategic endeavors, you need the will of the organization, or at least the masses, to be with you on that. And that's where the network leadership, I think, becomes really important.
Can I
Keep
tell
going,
a
and I'm
real
going to look at
simple story?
these
Yeah.
other questions.
When I was at Delta, one of my favorite opportunities was when I was moved into overseeing our call centers. And so I was asked by the CEO to move from running in-flight service to we were at a time of crisis around cost management. And so he said, will you go and run the call centers? I said, I don't know anything about running call centers. He said, this is about leadership. So I went, and we were looking to reduce cost at that time across 28 call centers, $100 million of cost. And so I went into this job not knowing anything about call centers and metrics and so forth and so forth and so on. But I had the good fortune of traveling to all 28 centers and said to the people that were there, we are looking to outsource all of your work. Mm-hmm. And so we can either put our heads together as a team and look at how do we improve customer service, revenue, reduce costs, all of those things, or we're looking at a significant amount of outsourcing. The fabulous thing is we developed all these work teams that came together, and over the course of 6 months, they found ways of segmenting the work such that revenue improved, service improved, costs were reduced. We closed down all but 9 offices. Everyone agreed to either take those that couldn't move to the 8 places that we were, take a job someplace else or leave. And it was one of the best examples of actually engaging with teams of people that were very influential to get the work done, and the success was in the outcome. But just a great story for me and a great learning for me about how to actually use informal networks to get things done.
I think we have a really interesting question here, and I'm going to read it the way it was written, but then I'm going to change a word in it. So the question is, what do you do with the challenging male leadership that is resistant to change? How have you handled this in the past, especially if that person is a senior officer? So I also want to challenge that question and change the word, what do you do with a challenging male leadership? What do you do with a challenging female leadership? I don't think it matters. What do you do with a senior person who's resistant to change? This would be a really good example of how networked leadership can work in the reverse, as opposed to always thinking that it's you in a senior position. I think it can work in the reverse, and I know that I did it for many years with my then CEO at the time. If you really want to make movement, you have to figure out how to do that. So I have a couple examples, and then we'll just kind of go around. I think it's all about influence, right? And so then you need to think about the network that influences that individual that is resistant to the change that you want to see. It's not about you and your network. You need to now be observant about who's their network internally in the organization. Do they have advisors and advocates and external resources that you know they listen to? Mary, I think you made a comment earlier about Andy McKenna, right, who's been so effective in so many people's careers, and it's that kind of an example. Do you know if that person has a mentor out there who might be influential on them and being able to kind of get access to that and help? So that's one example, but I'd like to go around. Juliet?
Sure. One thing that I'd say, you alluded to it, this whole conversation around networked leadership, we have focused on it for senior people, but I would offer that being effective at networked leadership is perhaps more important when you're in a more junior position in your career. Because if you may find yourself relying upon authority when you're in a more senior position, but in a more junior role, the only influence you have is your relationship and your ability to get others to come along. They really are not coming along because of your title. And so exercising that skill in those situations really serves you well for future. And you mentioned earlier being able to go back to people that knew you 20 years ago. Well, the way those relationships were handled 20 years ago before you became CEO really speak to whether you can tap back into those relationships. And so, it seems a little bit trite, but the relationships you're making today that are not transactional in nature, are not based on your hierarchy, are really what you will use and be able to leverage as you move forward in an organization. And when facing challenging leaders, and I think any challenge in business, it's much more about relationship than we care to acknowledge. And it may not be our direct relationship with that leader, but it really is sitting back and looking for these influencers and taking a much more circuitous route to get the buy-in around that person to be able to bring your message forward. You've got to be very diplomatic. You don't want to look as if you are, sort of going behind, say, your CEO's back or something on that level. But if it's a different approach that you really believe in, you want to make sure it's being heard and considered, then you've got to sell it to a lot of people, one relationship at a time, and leverage their buy-in to bring another along, to ultimately influence that more senior person or senior persons that you were finding to be difficult or not listening.
One thing I would add here is if the question is about an individual, an obstacle, someone that is resistant to change, whether they're above you, below there, alongside of you, male, female. I think this is but simple, but it's seek to understand. And you can do that through people who know this person. You can also sit down with that person. You can also do a good positive deposit in the emotional bank account and really try and understand what might be the barrier for that person. My experience is people who are resistant to change are afraid. So you need to really unravel the source of that fear, and you can sort of create some light in that process. That's my experience.
Anything else? I want to go back to a question that we had developed earlier, because I think this is also really important. How do you rebound from a networked leadership misstep? So do you have an example of a networked leadership misstep that you believe you've had in your career, and what was it, and how do you rebound from it?
I'll
Johnny?
start.
Julia?
Yeah. So I had a peer on a team that I had a very poor relationship with. And I got into the habit of working around that poor relationship, but it festered. And it ultimately became difficult for my team to react with his entire team, because we as two leaders had zero rapport. And I could give you a long list of all the problems with him. But this notion of networked leadership is something that I've long believed in and subscribed to. And I ultimately had to own that the misstep, the inability to leverage that relationship all belonged to me. And I had to figure out how to build a bridge. I'm not telling you that I will be best buds with this guy 20 years from now, but I will tell you this. Not working in the same organization, I can still call him, he will take the call, and vice versa, because the building of respect and trust and dialogue was the focus. Understanding his lens, his perspective, and why we had this impasse, and then working from that, finding places where we had common ground, which might not have been the most important issues. But my failure for a long period of time to build and repair that relationship was an impediment to me in the organization. And so I consider it a misstep, and one that I had to own fixing so that it could help the company, my team, and myself as a leader seeking to go forward in an organization.
Anybody else?
I had one that this will be like confessing, because it was completely on me. We had a relationship with a wonderful client where we had an omnicom level relationship, and there was a key leader, the lead account person. I had the need to replace them, and I did, with a very strong person, but from outside of our organization. And the business had tremendous momentum, and at the omnicom relationship level, we were doing many, many kinds of work for this client, and they relied on us to be the one who brought it all together. And within about 6 months of this woman taking this key leadership role, the client called me and said that one of our partners within the Omnicom fold was, and the words were this, failing. And I said, my goodness, they were had been incredibly strong, excellent people from the organization, but they were quote unquote failing. So I brought in the new person on our team, said, my goodness, I just heard from our client. She said, yeah, I really wanted to talk to you about that. They are failing. They're just doing a terrible job. And I said, well, you do realize that if they fail, you failed. And her jaw dropped, and then my jaw dropped that her jaw dropped. But what I realized is that it had been she came from a different culture, a different environment, and there were different expectations for that network leadership role. So it was on me, and I realized we didn't have this, in this evolution that I was talking about earlier, where that leadership role is really changing and the requirements are changing, we hadn't had enough definition around it. So we immediately did that, and then we created what we call Chief Integrator Training, and we've been running it every year so that we can set our own bar for what that role is, and not have any, because not every organization treats it the same way.
I want to take another from the audience. These are great questions, so keep them coming. We have somebody standing. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Kristen Prinz. I'm the principal at an employment law firm. And I find generally that a lot of times senior leaders don't really, or maybe have a rose-colored perspective on what's going on more layered in the organization. So how can you use networked leadership to get a more honest perspective of what's going on within those layers?
I will tell you, and then I'm going to throw this question out. It goes back to a fundamental term that we've thrown around a lot today, which is trust, building trusted relationships. And I'm a big believer that you have to have what I call listening posts in the organization, people throughout all different layers of the organization who are comfortable in sharing information with you because they trust that you will never violate it, that you're using that information to help understand where pockets of discontent, or so you don't have those, I totally agree, so you don't have the rose-colored glasses and you think that something that you've, said is going to happen from on high actually makes sense. And it's a two-way street, so it's partially you feeding information to people to test it and see how they feel about it, and it's also gathering information back and learning how, the organization, the pulse of the organization. I had one of my biggest network missteps in that regard with a listening post who was exposed. And this is somebody I'd had a trusted relationship with for a long time, and our CEO knew it at the time and just accidentally referenced the informational kind of exchange type of relationship we had that shocked a lot of the people that he worked with, his bosses, who were people that reported to me. I mean, frequently, network leadership is going in and around all the different organizational structures. So anybody want to add to that, Beth?
I'll add to it. I think it absolutely is one of the biggest challenges as a senior leader. And it was probably one of the hardest things for me to grapple with as I moved from being more that manager, doer leader to the more senior leader. But one of the things that I do is get out there and spend time with people and listen for what's not being said. I've always, they'll tell you what you want to hear, but listen to what they're not talking about. So if you have a strategic initiative going on and nobody's asking you about it, that's a clue. And you need to follow that clue and leverage the people who are out there. And you do need to have those trusted listening posts, the people that will say to you, and I had someone very recently say to me, I know at your level, Beth, they're not going to tell you this, but you need to know X, Y, Z about your team members. It was invaluable. Right? I'm not going to get that perspective. I don't know how my team members are interacting with other team members. Now, you don't go to that team member and say, hey, stop misbehaving. Obviously, you have to use that in a very respectful way. But getting out there, for me, getting out there and touching the people who are touching the customers every day and understanding where they are, that's how I try to use it, as well as these relationships that you have over time and you've developed that you can reach out to.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to a point you made earlier about communication in your network, or who
Right.
are the communicators.
Right.
Sometimes when people can't even reference your strategy, it's because something's missing all along the way.
Yeah. And so one other thing that what you said triggered is, it isn't always at work that you find out things, even when you're traveling, even when you're setting up these trees of communication or hubs of having people come to you. Sometimes the best things you learn about what's actually happening in an organization are after hours. So it's taking colleagues out for a cup of coffee, a glass of wine, a beer, or whatever, is really when you're going to find out what's happening in an organization. And I agree with everything that's been said. It isn't one or two things. It's usually 7 or 8 different ladders that you're going to find out if what Mara said to you is truly what's happening in the organization, so you're going to have to cross-check it. And it's complicated because the comment was, the higher up you get in the organization, the less information you actually get. I think we just have to acknowledge that, acknowledge you don't hear things the way you heard them when you were, a manager in the organization, and know going in that you've got to put these plans in place to really get at the truth. I think the most dangerous thing is thinking as a senior leader that people are naturally going to come to you the way they did when you were up here. They're not.
Interesting question from the audience. Does technology enable knowledge networking in your organization? Does technology enable it or not? And how and what tools have been effective? Anybody want to talk about technology in your organization?
So I'll take a different tack. In my organization, the thought that immediately came to mind is that technology is probably an inhibitor.
I had the same thought.
Yeah.
I did too.
And maybe others are leveraging it in unique ways, but technology drives the accelerated pace and all of those other challenges, lack of clarity around where we're moving, and it gets away from the direct interaction of human beings.
Right.
Which still has value in an organization, and you can really get lost and pulled away from that because of the drive of technology. And I think it falls to all of us to learn ways to use technology in a way that is our friend and an enabler of these network relationships as opposed to a blocker, which is how I reacted when I first heard the question.
I reacted the same way, and I think it's not just in organizations, but just in generations. And when I see a lot of people shaking heads, and if my kids were in here right now, they'd be doing this, like, what, there she goes again. But, social media and all of those different tools, I think sometimes have broken down the lines of communication in a way that people really understand what you're trying to do. I know at Navigant we use Yammer. Anybody have Yammer in your organizations? And it's like Facebook inside the organization, and my communications team is constantly trying to get me to get on there and blog, and as a way to be more connected and exchange
I
information.
think it's very dangerous to think one extreme or the other, because of course technology enables information sharing. I mean, if we didn't use technology to transfer thought capital and work, it would, we use it, think about it, in your personal access, how often you're using technology to get information. So I think we definitely leverage it as an organization. We leverage it between our clients for information sharing sites and workflow management systems. However, if you let that be the means of the full communication, you lose so much, because you have to get together and talk about that analysis and really make sure you're extracting the best insights from it and make human connections over it. But yeah, it'd be crazy though not to take advantage of technology because you're afraid that it would be too limiting. And it is if people just hide behind their computers, but I think it's a combination of both.
Especially when you're working in a global environment. You don't have access to all the people that you work with, even once a year. Technology is really a great enabler to connect with people around the globe. So that I agree with you. I think either extreme is probably not healthy, and both are necessary in really exceeding in this area of networked leadership.
So I'm going to put these next two questions together because I think they are good leverage points on each other. We'll start with, we're talking about network leadership, but many of us are already leaders. So are we missing the opportunity to educate young leaders early in their career on how to develop networks and good relationships? What can we do from a training and education perspective in organizations to develop people more on this concept? And I'm going to add to the second question, which is, constructing networks is one thing, but figuring out how to leverage them is something totally different. So what skills are really required to be an effective network leader? So I kind of want to put those two together. What can we be doing to do more training and education within our organizations? And, once you've figured out what that is, what skills should we really be focusing on for a networked leader?
I'll start.
Okay.
I think, first of all, it has to be a conscious discussion. So I don't think that a lot of times we think about it consciously. It sounds like at BBDO they do a little bit, but really putting it out there and talking about the necessity of developing these relationships. So as a boss, Your primary job is to remove barriers for your teams. You may not know that, but that's what your job is. And in order to understand what those barriers are, you need to have a network, they need to have a network, they need to be able to come up to you and talk to you about what those are. But we need to do it in a conscious way. So I had somebody give me a tool once that I would share with all of you. And it goes into one of the earlier questions a little bit. But when you get ready to go into a meeting and present an idea, how many of you just go in and present the idea? How many of you just go in and present the idea? Because here's the idea, present it. How many of you take the time to think about who is going to be in the meeting, who their networks are, what perspective they're going to have, and how you work that before you go in the meeting? Whether it's going directly, right? So that is the best advice I could give to anyone, right? Is think about the fact that you're there to remove barriers, and your boss is there to remove barriers. But if you're getting ready to solve a problem, do a presentation, bring a group of people together, think about where they're coming from. Not just your boss or that difficult one, but everybody around there. Because guess what? By doing that conscious effort, sit down with a friend, sit down with your boss and say, we're going into this thing, you know, Kate's going to be there. What's her perspective? Anna's going to be there. What's her perspective? Where are they and what are their networks? And how are they going to react to it? So I think that's a tool that as leaders you can bring, without doing formal training or any of those other things, bring your teams up to speed on having those dialogues and helping you. You may bring your team and say, I'm getting ready to go present to this group. Who do you guys know? What are you hearing about this? And leverage that, engage that in a thoughtful, conscious way.
Yes, question, and then I do want to get to this one, which I think is important.
Thanks, everyone. I have a question. Vicki, I'm going to start with you. A lot of internal networking, it's your job. And I suspect whoever that bad person was, it would affect their performance review. So there's incentives to try and cooperate with networked leadership and networking internally. With externally, and particularly your business is of interest to me because it's networking through influence. That you have such an incredible volunteer network in your organization. And I was wondering if you can share some strategies that are successful in encouraging other people who don't have to meet with you to want to meet with you and join your vision, mission, and values.
Yeah, so the fortunate thing I'd say about most nonprofits that are mission focused is that they align around typically the interest of the individual, whether it's around microfinance for women or feeding kids or educating children or, you know, look at all the health issues that we've got out there that are being addressed. Interesting point is nonprofits today are 12% of the GDP, so it's a really big part of our overall business as, you know, as we look at the US. So I think people are more naturally drawn to mission-driven organizations than they are nonprofits, although there's some great nonprofits. So that gives us a little bit of a leg up. The other thing that we do, and I think other great nonprofits do to bring volunteers in and keep them engaged, is actually take them to the work. So once you go and you visit with a woman who survived the genocide in Rwanda, and you see that she took $100 and created a business and sent her kids to school, college, university, so forth and so on, and is now employing 10 women in her country, there's no leaving that experience. So engaging in the experience of the organization really pulls people in and connects them in a way that's not like anything I've ever seen. The third thing I would say is actually having authenticity around whatever it is that you're doing, such that you have donors and or investors, because we're not just looking at philanthropic dollars now, we're actually looking at a lot of social impact dollars. So being authentic and real around the experience and around what you are saying and doing, and knowledgeable such that you can answer most any question that an investor or donor has for you, really builds those kinds of relationships. Those are just a few things I'd offer.
Anybody else want to contribute? Okay. I'm going to ask this next question because I thought it was important. Conversation is an element of U.S. centricity. So for those of you running global organizations, are there different ways, hints, to get at the goal outside of the U.S.?
What's the first part of the question? I missed it.
The conversation is an element of U.S. centricity. So
Yeah.
we,
Yeah,
which is
yeah.
often the case, when in Rome. But I would offer that, so we have a global organization. I travel extensively on behalf of Navigant to our foreign offices, not just for the employees, but for our clients as well. And I would tell you, and this comes into another question that somebody asked, culture is such a huge part of how
Huge.
effective you're going to be in the use of networked leadership for a purpose outside the U.S. So for me, it's really getting to know and understand the culture of the country that I'm going to, of the people that I'm going to be meeting with, the business protocols, how are they different, what is expected in your meetings, the types of things that are, there's a lot of learning, and I think, unfortunately, as Americans we are a little smug to that, of realizing that how we interact in business is not the same. So I think learning as much as you can about the area that you're going to and how people conduct business meetings, what are the right protocols, is so important to being effective in building those relationships into your internal and external network. If anyone wanted to add to that from a global perspective.
Go ahead.
Well, I'm wondering why it's a U.S.-centric conversation. I'm just thinking about, I operate in a global network, and it's funny because some organizations have central points that you can, like global HR or whatever, and we have a rule of thumb that we talk about, which is just call 2 people. So you need to solve a problem in Shanghai, you just call 2 people. And you start anywhere in the network, by the time you get to the second person, you're going to have an answer. I feel I use that all the time, and it therefore is a small world, but I also feel I'm on the receiving end of people who are trying to network through us here in the U.S. So I don't know if I misunderstood I'm just wondering about the U.S. centricity of the question.
Let me find the question. I think it simply came from, it said the conversation has an element of U.S. centricity.
I would just, I'm not going to build on that point, just pivot a little bit. The thread that I hear here, and hopefully we're all taking away, it really is just going back to the relationship and taking the time to do the work around who you are interfacing with, where and when. So whether it's a US-only meeting and you're figuring out who's in the meeting and who are their networks, whether you're anywhere in the globe, it's the point that we should be taking away from this conversation is it's not just you getting your message and agenda pushed through. It's about building the relationship, understanding your audience, building a rapport, understanding how you need to show up with that audience in whatever part of the globe so that it is meaningful, effective, not offensive. And if you don't think you want to take the time to do that homework, then don't go to the meeting or don't expect to have the success. That really is the common thread through this conversation.
Yeah, so I just had one thing, and that is I really agree so strongly with your thinking around culture. I was in India the early part of the year for a couple of weeks, and then in Africa 2 weeks ago, in Malawi, and then in Uganda. And I had a number of friends here that said, "Oh my gosh, you're going to Africa? Aren't you afraid of Ebola?" So, it's laughable, but guys, many Americans don't realize that Africa is a continent, that they think it's a country. A lot of people do. A lot of my friends do, so I'll just say my friends. But within Africa, you can fit the United States, you can fit India, and you can fit Russia. It is a massive continent. And within the continent of Africa alone, every single country has a different culture and a different approach and a different language and a different way that you get...
Different traditions that
Different
you
traditions.
need to
You go through
respond
the
to.
chief to do certain things. Mm-hmm. And we have to respect going into those places and knowing the right ways of approaching business there to be really successful. I think it's back to what you were saying. It's actually walking in the shoes of the person that you're meeting with. You know, getting someone that's from there to accompany you and to really have enough courage and enough trust to show you how to do the work. But it's, I hear the question. I actually applaud the person who mentioned it. I think it's really important for those of us who do global work that we really get this notion of culture down and respect and appreciate it.
We have an audience question. We have about 5 minutes left in the program. Okay.
My name is Felicia Davis. I'm the commissioner for the Chicago Department of Buildings. So first, I just wanted to make a comment to that last. Prior to coming into government, I worked for a small company that was acquired by a big global company. And one thing that I learned, because it's about emails, at that time, I was so local, so Chicago-centric that I assumed that, of course, everyone's on my time. And so when I started, it's morning here, and I would start an email with good morning. And then one of the first things that I had to learn was, when you are in this global context, the time of day where the other person or the other party is, if we're on a conference call or a Go meeting, that it varies. And so just even starting with that first premise, being sensitive about the time, it's daytime here in Chicago, but it doesn't mean that it's daytime anywhere else. And I still, to this day, when I start an email, I first think about where are the people in the world that I'm sending this email to and what's the time of day there. So I wanted to make that, because that's something simple that we could all do differently. When we write an email, the next email that you write, think about where is the receiver and what time of day is it when they will be reading this email. But the question that I have is, and I think Mary talked about this earlier, I've worked in a lot of different fields. So I started out in law enforcement for 10 years, I was in higher education administration for 10 years, and now I'm in government. The struggle that I find is that women are still siloed in their fields. So lawyers tend to be with lawyers, and architects hang out with architects. And I'm the commissioner for the Department of Buildings. I always start everything, I'm neither an architect or an engineer, right? So that's not my background. But what I find is that there's a value in all the other networks that I bring with me to this role. And I think it's important, and maybe you could, any of you can share that information about prior roles that you have been in, and how it's complete different context, but how important it is to still have connection to those networks and bring those networks along with you and your current role and potentially future roles.
Anybody want to take a stab at that?
I think you just said it. No, I know. I seriously, I do think you just said it, which is this is a continuum. People that I've worked for now work for me. People people that I've worked with were now with competitors. Like, these relationships shift, and this is moving in and out of industry. So it is taking the long view in building networks and building relationships, to your point, and they can be leveraged. And I agree with you that we tend to run in circles that come from the same profession, which is one of the reasons why I really love the network, because it gets me out of my lawyer space and gets me the opportunity to know other leaders who come from completely different professional backgrounds. So, a shout out for the network and what it provides for us.
One of the things that we do at Navigant is we run a women's leadership conference once a year that is not directed at a particular discipline or skill or industry sector, but rather touches on all the various industry sectors that we work with. And so we bring senior women from all over the world together, and we have a great time in leadership development. And I think there's some people in the audience who have been with us over the years for that. And the real benefit of it is the relationships that you make with somebody from a different industry in a different part of the company. And these become a term that we use at Navigant, your cohorts, that you will go and rely upon, not immediately, maybe not a month later, but at some point, that will be a cohort group that you will have to help you be more effective in business. I am mindful that we're coming to the end of the time. I did have one last question, because I think it's important, that I'll just throw out here to the group, which is network leadership and organizational transaction leadership. They're different. They can coexist. In fact, they must coexist. How do we become smarter? How do you know when to use these forms of leadership in appropriate ways, when one is more important than the other, or whether you need to actually blend them? Anybody?
Go ahead.
Juliet, Vicki?
I'll dive in.
Go for it.
So for me, when you have to make a quicker decision around things that might be a tough and hard decision, but it needs to be made within a finite amount of time, I think transactional leadership is important. And it gets to the notion of, I think really effective leaders make, and understand they're going to have to make 20% of the decisions on their own. 80% are to be made collaboratively. And so that would be my thinking is, I think when you step into a role, you know that it is, these senior positions can be very isolating. We've talked about that. And you know that, and you know you're going to have to make those decisions. And then the 80%, maybe it's 30, 70, I don't know, but it's somewhere in there, is the way it breaks out.
And I think it's an important point that you said when you have a decision that needs to be made quickly.
Yeah.
How many people here constantly have people telling you, this is urgent and immediate? Right?
All the time.
All the time.
All the time.
All the time. A direct report say, we must do this today, yesterday, tonight. I need to speak with you in an hour. I think that's honestly one thing that you can do is to push back and really understand the dynamics of the timing of the decision. Is it really urgent or not? Anybody else want to add to?
I wanted to make
I'm getting the wrap-up sign back
wrap-up,
there.
okay.
Go ahead, Juliet.
Is it okay? All right.
Just saying wrap up. We're wrapping.
So I was just going to say that I think it requires us to be more nimble and able to pivot between these two different types of decision making and make them an everyday part of our toolkit. And what I really wanted to just say, I'm in what's called a support services function within a company, legal, so legal, HR, IT. This issue of network leadership, I think, is particularly important for those of us in those spaces within corporate organizations. You know, there was a time 20 plus years ago when we could rely so heavily on our technical expertise. And now today, you know, I consider it a failure if someone says we're not doing it because legal said we can't. That means that my team is not using its network leadership, right? And so we're a part of the organization. We're building relationship. We're making a business decision as to why we're going here, why this is the best direction for the company. And so if we're in those types of functions, using these types of tools to help us individually and to help our functions be better partners to the business, I think is critically important.
Well said. Nice wrap up.
Yeah.
Anyways, I want to thank my co-panelists today. I think it's been a wonderful dialogue. I want to thank all of you for participating and your questions. And we'll look forward to being here on the break before the luncheon if you want to continue the conversation. Thank you.